So I'd like to now continue with a focus on ISO's work, and I'm going to do that by kicking off with a quick summary on where we are in TC322, ISO's Technical Committee on Sustainable Finance. Next slide, please. It's probably just worth, most people will be familiar with ISO who are on this call, but just a reminder that it's an independent non-governmental organization. It's made up of a global network of national standards bodies, and I think it has two real USPs. One is it has a very well-established, proven consensus building process, which enables the generation of expert-led standards. And secondly, it has a phenomenal global membership with 165 members as shown on the map there, really covering a true global spread. And that's a real compliment to some of the other organizations such as the G20 that we heard from about from Dr. Ma. It enables the real engagement with all countries globally. Next slide. So in terms of this committee, it's worth just reflecting that we only had our first plenary in March 2019, a relatively new committee, and that's not because sustainable finance and environmental management and climate have been new topics at all to ISO, but a recognition that there was maybe a value in having a dedicated committee which was made up particularly predominantly of those with activities in the finance industry for that particular segment of the economy. We are just starting a revision of our published strategic business plan. I don't think there will be major changes, but any comments that people have on that will be particularly timely. We have 24 participating and another 17 observer countries. That's continuing to grow. We'd like to see it grow further. There are more countries involved in this webinar, and if you are one of those countries, then please consider getting involved. We have at the moment 10 formal external liaison members, including the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is now morphing with the International Integrated Reporting Foundation to the Value Reporting Foundation. We also have NGOs such as WWF, the Global Alliance on Banking and Values, and also the IIF that we've just heard from Sonia. We also lead contributions to some of the international discussions, and I hope that's been self-evident from the early stage that we do see that it's very important for ISO to reach out and others to reach out to ISO for us to collaborate. Sonia mentioned Mark Carney's particular efforts in the run-up to COP26 to bring many of the standard makers, including ISO, together, and we play a role in that. Next slide, please. I'm going to just briefly talk about our scope and our strategy. The scope is defined as standardization in the field of sustainable finance to integrate sustainability considerations, including ESG practices in the financing of economic activities. So the key point here is it is broad. We are looking at sustainable finance, and we see climate finance, climate adaptation and mitigation finance, and green finance, which apply to the environmental side, and socio-environmental activities as a component, rather in the way that sustainable development is an aggregation of environmental, social, economic, and governance issues. Next slide. Next, that's it, thank you. So in terms of the rationale, we see standards within this enormous sustainable finance ecosystem. It's a big beast, the financial global markets. And one way of looking at it is this, which is adapted from Boston consulting work. And standards are there on the right. They're an enabling function. They enable players within that market to carry out their functions. So that includes those players who are involved in the capital flow, who are designing products, who are defining the demand, who are providing the supply of capital, and all the intermediaries, the banks and asset owners who sit in that supply-demand chain. But also standards have an applicability to those involved in governance, those involved in policy and in regulation. And indeed, standards can often provide a soft form of regulation as it's described. That means providing a regulatory structure by either compelling or referring to standards without the need for actual legislation by the parliamentary or the governing bodies of a country's jurisdiction. And then standards are also extremely important in supporting those involved in the market infrastructure and the wider stakeholders' needs. And stakeholder needs are particularly important, I think, in the field of sustainable finance, where we need to shift the focus away from just a financial outcome in terms of a profit motive, but one which looks at the actual deliverable outcomes to society that arise from the application of capital. Thank you. Next slide. So looking at that same umbrella, where is the rationale for ISO TC322? And this is very much what Dr. Ma was also referring to. We have all of these organizations and many more actually at the bottom who have produced really valuable standards and guidance and principles which are already impacting on the adoption of sustainable finance practices. What ISO can do, I believe, is provide a repository, a structure within which the organizations in the financial world can navigate and utilize the strengths of those standards. So our focus at the moment is on an umbrella standard to set out certain principles and frameworks under which the sort of two dimensions, if you like, of activities take place. Across the top, you have aspects such as stewardship, management and governance, assurance and verification, transparency and disclosure, impact assessment, and then there will be others. Dr. Ma mentioned third-party engagement is being one that is emerging. But these are generic issues which are applicable across the piece, and it's possible to produce standards maybe which actually help marshal consistency and reduce complexity amongst the current activities. And then on the left-hand side, we have the dimension looking at what actually the activities are. And at a most simple level, you can divide those into those which operate at an organizational level within a financial institution, for example, and those which apply to a particular product or service. And already, as you'll hear later, that is how we are beginning to marshal our work. Next slide, please. So our strategy can be summed up here. It's amplifying our role to be able to deliver the transition to sustainable finance and to complement the activities that are going on already. There is no need for duplication, but we do need the endeavours of all, I think, to provide the necessary speed and pace behind the transition that's necessary. So our activities focus around building strong links with relevant international organisations, and the first part of the webinar you'll hear some of the fruits of that. To reach out to new countries and enable engagement, to really empower ISO to use its global network to bring in as much engagement as possible. And then to deliver our core work through 5 main internal activities. And you will hear a lot more about this going forward in the remainder of the webinar. Provide strategic support to relevant ISO standards. So, for example, in financial services, we're going to hear from Rebecca Healy next, where she is involved. But also in asset management, in governance, environmental performance, and social responsibility. Secondly, to develop a sustainable finance framework standard, and this is the most developed of the full standards we have, and you'll hear more from our convener Hayden Morgan about that. We are about to publish a terminology guide, and you'll hear about the activities from that from Bolu Wang. We combine our experts with others within the ISO network. An example is the framework for assessing and reporting investments and financing activities related to climate, which is 14100, and we'll hear from Li Pang Chung about that. But also in other areas such as the environmental performance evaluation for green debt instruments, which are coming out to the market right now, the 14030 series, which are coming out in 4 parts. We also contribute to the harmonization and alignment and the demystifying of sustainable finance standards in our approach to selecting new work. And that is the last presentation you'll hear from France Connect today.